Our All-Star Roundtable this week, Dale Butland, Communications Director for Innovation Ohio, a progressive think tank, and Doug Preisse, Chairman of the Executive Committee of the Franklin County Republican Party. Welcome back to both of you. Republicans doing a little bit of adjustment these days, but right out of the gate after the election, at the State House this week, we saw a push to get rid of funding for Planned Parenthood in Ohio. Is that a wise move, Doug, for your party to start on Planned Parenthood right after an election when Americans seem to say that's not the issue we worry about?
Well, when you say right out of the gate, there were a lot of pieces of legislation pending. That's one of them. I think it's important that we must not lose sight of the importance and not take steps backward in providing health care opportunities and health care for women in the state of Ohio, especially in poorer areas, especially in rural areas, and this legislation doesn't do that. It does change priorities and moves Planned Parenthood down and moves up several hundred other health care providers, both private and public, in the state, but they don't provide abortion services. There is a difference.
So it is an abortion-based piece of legislation.
That's what's driving the proponents of this. Whether it makes it through the legislature or not is problematic. I would say when you read about that in the newspaper, and the opposition is trying to stoke that up as the single most important issue, if you read the newspaper today too, you saw legislation, Republican-sponsored, going through with bipartisan support, trying to get a greater handle on the prescription drug problem that continues to exist. We saw happily sailing through, finally, after many years, I shouldn't say sailing, but our own State Senator Jim Hughes here, for the first time ever, Ohio is going to have a puppy mill bill,
yes,
and hopefully remove that black eye. Our Attorney General pushing legislation and initiatives against these exotic drugs, these manufactured drugs. So there's a lot going on down there. Opponents trying to sensationalize Planned Parenthood beyond what I think it is in reality right now.
Do you think that's the case, Dale? Is this just too much attention placed on one of those hot button issues?
You know, Doug and his party don't learn real quick, apparently. We just had a national election where there was a gender gap at historic highs, and one of the reasons that it's there is because the Republican Party continues to condescend to women, and, you know, faster than you can say Todd Akin and Richard Murdoch, who are the two Senate candidates who got into trouble talking about rape. Here they come, the first rattle out of the box. What do? They come back to talk not just about defunding Planned Parenthood again, but they're also bringing back the so-called heartbeat bill, which would effectively outlaw abortion, all abortion, even in cases of rape and incest. And then you have Governor Kasich making his second appointment, his consumer appointment to the Ohio State Medical Board. That's what regulates doctors in our state. It's the president of Ohio Right to Life. I don't know what it's going to take, Doug, but if you guys keep this stuff up, you're going to find this gender gap widening and widening, and you're never going to win an election.
Well,
it does seem,
it's
Doug,
the fact that the last 5 presidential elections in a row, there's been a gender gap. I wish that weren't the case. There's another gender gap too in the other direction with men and Democrats. I mean, these things are part of the political spectrum. As I say, I'm not sure you're even going to see some of this stuff make it out of the legislature. There is no question. You're not going to hear me say that the Republican Party isn't the party of the sanctity of life, although there are pro-choice Republicans. The Democrats tend to shove the pro-life Democrats out of the party more strenuously than the other direction.
The problem, Doug, is the extremist nature of your party on this issue. Most people in Ohio believe that there should be exceptions for rape and incest. You know, somebody said after this election that you know your party is in trouble when somebody says, did the rape guy lose? And you have to ask, which one?
Well, that's a nice soundbite, but the fact of the matter is I'm glad you brought it up for the second time in this sitting because, as many other responsible Republicans have said, we don't stand by those irresponsible, those stupid comments by those candidates, and we see where they got.
But you're bringing up a bill right now that will Doug, your bill right now, this heartbeat bill.
That's different from the rape comments that you're trying to.
But it's not, and I'll tell you why it's not. The heartbeat bill would outlaw abortion even in cases of rape.
We'll see where it goes.
But you're bringing it up the first time.
I didn't bring it up. You brought it up.
You've got a problem.
And I told you about a lot of other things that are important to the voters and the citizens of Ohio, including getting a handle on developing jobs, which is the primary effort that this governor is doing through jobs. That is exactly.
So why aren't you
You're
doing
trying
that?
to characterize this entire administration as this one bill so you can raise money on it and divert the attention from the fact that your newly elected president, re-elected, has done nothing to turn the economy around. But we have here in Ohio.
Doug, I'm not going to try to talk over you. Your party has a branding problem. You just talked about the last 5 elections. Your party has now lost the popular vote in 5 out of the last 6 presidential elections. Now that tells me that the people ain't buying what your party's selling.
Your president was just re-elected
in a landslide in the Electoral College.
I wouldn't define it as a landslide. Also,
326 electoral votes.
I thought you weren't going to try to talk over me. Your president was just re-elected with less percent of the popular vote and fewer Electoral College votes than any president re-elected.
Wait, Colleen, I can't let that.
Okay, I've got to say this though.
I'll come up for air if you will.
First day after the election, or the first Friday after the election, when the president held his news conference. You know, you're saying a landslide in the Electoral College. It was not a landslide in the popular vote. It was very close. Barely 50, a little more than 50% of the people in this country voted for Barack Obama because voters are frustrated with people not being able to come to the center and get a consensus. He did not have a mandate, and yet when he had his news conference, he made it sound like he had a mandate because he said, this is what the people of the country want me to do. Well, he kind of came out of the gate drawing a line in the sand again. And don't you think both parties have to find some way to get rid of the line in the sand and get to the table?
Let me respond in this way. Number one, with regard to his vote this last time, in the last 100 years, there have been 4 presidents who have gotten more than 50% of the vote 2 times in a row. They were Dwight Eisenhower, Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan, and Obama. So please, when you try to discount the magnitude of this win, I think that is going against history. Now, with regard to the Bush tax cuts, if there was one thing that the voters were absolutely clear about in this election, both sides campaigned exactly on the issue of whether the rich should pay a little larger share in order to reach a balanced budget deal.
It sure was a key issue. It
was a key issue. There was no mistake as to where the two sides stood. President Obama won, and every poll that's been taken for the last year and a half, including the exit polls after the election, showed 60% of the people are in favor of the rich paying a higher share. So that's something the president is not going to compromise on. We will not reach a balanced budget by putting it all on the backs of the middle class and the poor. We just had an election on that subject, and the people have spoken.
And if we go back to the tax rates of several years ago, we're not going to balance the budget either, because that's going to make up about 10% of the deficit. We will balance the budget if we do what this governor did and found a way to cut growth in spending. This governor, who with your previous president worked together across lines, when John Kasich was chairman of the Budget Committee and President Clinton, they finally got to a place where they could find some common ground and maybe the line you're talking about erased temporarily.
The problem that we have is that the Republicans have said they will not allow any rate increases on millionaires and billionaires. We're talking about the top 2% now, right? We're only talking about going back to the rates that were in effect when Bill Clinton was president, a top margin rate of 39.6%. In that time, Doug, let me remind you, we created 22 million jobs after we increased the top tax rate to 39.6. George Bush came in and cut them as to where they are now, and we had the slowest job growth since the end of World War II.
You know what?
So what are we arguing about here?
Well, I don't know, but I don't know if
I want to touch on something you touched on very briefly, because we're almost out of time, and I can't let you get away because I know you're at the table, the insiders for John Kasich. There's a lot of talk now that the Republicans had the loss this week that John Kasich is one of the people on a lot of people's short list for 2016. Is that something you think he's even thinking about at this? I know he says he's concentrating on being governor of Ohio, but
I can tell you.
But let's be realistic. If that's the conversation going on, he's got to at least be thinking about it.
Clearly, he's a successful governor in even just his first 2 years. Clearly, he's an attractive national presence. But here's the jobs that I know John Kasich is concerned about: being governor, being a father, being a good husband and maybe occasionally a golfer, but he's working so darn hard he doesn't get much time for that. So that's as far as I know his head is, because he is so focused on doing the job that he was elected to 2 years ago, and I suspect he'll want to be elected to it in about 2 years from now. So everything else is just a speculation that happens after any loss. The pundits around the country go scrambling to be the first one to predict who the next candidate is. It's way too early.
And Dale, we're almost out of time, but I'll give you the last word on, on election night. Very quickly after Obama was announced as a winner in Ohio, they were holding up Kasich, your next signs here in Ohio. Are the Democrats targeting him right now? I mean, is that going to be the focus for the Democrats in the next couple of years?
Well, the voters have just come through a beating with this election. We ought to have a decent interval before we start talking about the next one. But let me just say that on election night, I thought it was interesting. The Governor Kasich never did come down to talk to the press. He sent down other statewide office holders. He sent down, I think you were down there talking to folks. It was typical Governor Kasich, though. Insufferable in victory, invisible in defeat. There was a poll out this week that shows that if John Kasich runs for re-election, he's way under 50%, and he's got a 1-point lead on a generic Democrat. So when Governor Kasich runs for re-election, I'm confident that he will have a real fight on his hands.